Good afternoon, everyone. I will try and talk nice and slow for you. I was very honoured to be asked to come to Uruguay and talk about my research today, and I very much would like to thank the organising committee of the seminar for their invitation. So I am from Orange in New South Wales, which is about 270 kilometres west of Sydney. So it takes a long time to get here. So, and I'm very excited to be going on the sheep tours for the next 3 days to learn more about the sheep industry in Uruguay and perhaps to meet some more of you as we go along the next few days. So as I was introduced, I'll be talking to you about how we can improve productivity in our sheep flocks through more precise management of our sheep. So to start with, for those of us who are familiar with sheep, we know that not all sheep are the same. I've got some friends who don't work in the sheep industry and they say to me, but Sue, the sheep are all the same. One sheep is the same as the next. But those of us that know sheep, we can understand that if we have a flock of sheep, that they're not all the same. Some of the differences between the sheep are very easy to pick. We can easily pick the sheep that grow more wool or less wool. We can pick some sheep that perhaps have faults like fleece rot or yellow colour. But for other traits like some diseases or reproduction or growth, it's very difficult to pick which sheep are better than others. And so we have to start looking at ways we can do that to improve our productivity. And this is some key information that sort of stands behind this whole concept. So what it shows you in the middle or the average column is the average performance of a flock of sheep. Now this is some sheep that were grown at a place called Trangie in central New South Wales, about 600 kilometres west of Sydney. So of these sheep, and there was about 2,000 in the group, the average fleece weight was 4.6 kilograms, the diameter was about 20.4, and their staple strength, or how strong the wool is, was about 35 newtons per kilotex. The growth rate of the progeny from the flock was about 284 grams, and the depth of fat on their ribs was about 10.6 millimetres. On average, the weaning rate was about 86%. And the bottom two under the profitability that shows you that the average fleece value in Australian terms was about $54 per ewe, and the carcass value about $34. That gives you an idea of the average performance of those animals. But you can see that we have quite a big difference between the top 25%, which are these ones here, and the bottom 25%. So these are the top performers in the flock, and these are the bottom. And you can see that for all the traits I've got listed in the table, there's quite a big difference between the top performers and the bottom performers. And that provides us with some really good opportunities to start to identify who are the best performers in our flock, who are the sheep we want to keep in our flock, and which are the ones that are going to make us the most money. It also allows us to identify what we call the passengers in our flock. So these are the ones that are in the flock, they're competing with the performers for food, for water, for space, but they're not delivering us any real improvements in terms of price and in terms of production. They don't cut very much wool, their wool's a bit broader, their wool is not quite as good quality, they don't grow as fast, and their reproductive rate isn't as good. So what we're trying to do with the work we're doing in Australia is to identify the performers, work out who our best sheep are, and keep those in our flock, and identify those passengers, and look at ways we can either improve their performance or just get them out of our flock altogether, so we don't want them anymore. So this is a graph of diameter, fibre diameter, along the bottom axis, you can't see that, and then fleece weight along the top. So each one of those blue dots is a ewe from a flock I was working on near Orange. And what it shows you is that there are some ewes that cut very heavy fleeces of nice fine wool, and there are some ewes in the flock that cut lighter fleeces of much broader wool. And again, the ones in the top corner where I've got the word performers, they're the animals that are making us money. The ones in the bottom corner where I have the word passengers, they're the ones that are costing us money. So that's for fleece production. The same story happens when you look at weaning weight and post-weaning growth of young merino sheep. This is some data from some commercial properties we were working on around Orange. And again, each one of those dots is one individual weaner from 12 or 13 different sheep properties. And again, you can see in the corner of the graph where I have the word performers, these are the weaners that wean at a very nice, heavy weaning weight and that grow fast after weaning. And then in the corner where I have the word passengers, these are the sheep that have very light weight at weaning and they don't grow very fast. We also know from our work, and I know it seemed from what Georgette was saying yesterday, that the sheep that wean at a light weight and they don't grow very fast, they're the ones that are most likely to die or get infected by parasites or disease. So again, they are our passengers. So the concept of precision sheep management is about managing groups of sheep or individual sheep differently according to their own production potential or their risk potential, rather than managing the whole flock together. And this can lead to improvements in whole flock productivity by improved selection. So we're deciding which animals we want to keep in our flock for longer. We can target our nutrition to the groups of animals that will need it the most or will benefit the most. We can target our disease management to those animals that require it rather than treating the whole flock. So just by improving our management interventions to those animals that require it, we're actually cutting our costs down because we're not treating animals that don't need it. It can also help us to deliver products better to our market specifications. So for instance, in our flock with our very fine wool producers, they might be in some parts of New South Wales can be very dusty. So we can put coats on the fleece and we find that can improve quality, improve style, improve colour and generate returns. You can target the animals that grow quicker, you can turn them off quicker to your lamb market and perhaps feed animals more that don't grow quite as quick. So by looking at what animals are doing well for you, which ones aren't, you can make targeted management decisions to improve your flock profitability. And the challenge is how to identify those animals in a way that's cheap and easy and accurate. We don't want to do things that are costing us too much money because that will mean it'll decrease our profitability at the end. So what we're interested in is to develop simple technologies that you can build up to more complicated technologies if you wish, but also looking at things that are low labour, because in Australia the average age of our sheep producing farmers is probably 55 to 60 years of age, and there's not a lot of labour around what there was compared to 20 or so years ago. So you want to do things in a low labour way that's easy and cost effective. And there are a number of different pathways that generate the benefits from precision sheep management. We can get benefits in our current generation. So in the flock of sheep we see in front of us, by keeping our passengers and getting rid of our performers, we're improving our profitability in the current generation. I do lots of work with genetics, like Dr. Ponzoni. So as well as improving our current generation, we're actually improving our future generations as well by keeping better performing ewes in the flock, and their progeny will be better for future generations. We can also optimise our flock structure. So generally in Australia, you have ewes, you join them for the first time at 2 years of age, and then you manage them in separate age groups, 2-year-old, 3-year-old, 4-year-old, 5-year-old, and generally you cull them all as one age group when they are 6. That is the way it's been for a very long time. But by looking at individual animal performance, you can actually keep your better performing animals longer. Just because they're 6 years old doesn't mean they are rubbish. If they are good performers and they are sound animals, you can keep them for longer and you can optimise the age structure of your flock. So you have less, you don't need as many replacements in your flock and you can sell more of your higher value young sheep. It also helps us, as I said before, to choose the animals that are targeted for high value markets and to recognise early in life the animals that aren't going to make us very much money and to get them out of our flock earlier. So I'll go through an example of how we put this process into work. And I'm going to talk about variation in net reproduction rate and its components. So net reproduction rate is the number of lambs weaned per ewe. And it's a similar table to what I showed you at the start. So the middle or the average column shows you the average reproductive performance of a group of animals over 10 years at our resource flock at Trangie. And you can see that on the average performance of the flock, the average fertility number of ewes that got into lamb was about 79%. The average litter size was about 1.4. The lamb survival to 3 days of age was about 73%. And our net reproduction rate, number of lambs weaned, 84%. That was the average performance of the flock. But if you look at the top 25% of the flock, the best ewes ranked on reproductive performance, 85% fertility. So most of those ewes are getting pregnant reliably every year. The litter size was 1.6. So most of those ewes that are getting pregnant are having twins for you every year. And despite the fact of that high twinning rate, those top 25% of ewes in the flock, 90% of their lambs are surviving to 3 days of age. And 138% are being weaned. So even though the average weaning rate or average net reproduction rate was only 84%, the top 25% of ewes are weaning at 138%. Now, and this is merinos, which in Australia people say merinos are poor mothers, they're terrible sheep. Well, I'm showing you here they're very good sheep. Especially if you can compare the performance to the bottom 25%. So these are all animals run in the same condition, the same pasture, but look at what's happening. Out of the bottom 25%, only half of the ewes are getting pregnant. If they do get pregnant, they're only going to have single lambs. And even though they're only having single lambs, nearly half of them are dying by three days of age. And you're ending up with a net reproduction rate of those animals of only 30%. So in Australia, those ewes may as well be wethers. You don't need them in your breeding flock. You want to identify who they are and take them out, because all they're doing is competing with your good producers, your good reproduction ewes for resources, and that's not what we want. So how do we know? How do we know who the best ewes are? And some work that some of my colleagues did a few years ago has shown us that if you look at a ewe's performance when she's 2 years of age and when she's 3 years of age, that is a very good way to predict what her performance will be for her whole lifetime. Okay? So we can start to then do some selection based on what the ewes are doing at 2 and 3 years of age, knowing that that will help us to decide if they are our passengers or our performers. So pregnancy scanning. We had a discussion at lunchtime, and pregnancy scanning by transabdominal ultrasound is much more common in Australia than in Uruguay. So between about 30 and 40% of all breeding ewes in Australia are scanned for pregnancy status. And that's mostly to help sheep producers identify twins and single-bearing ewes and manage the nutrition. And Paul will talk about that a little bit more after the break of how they do things in New Zealand. But what we're doing with this information is as well as using the information to manage our nutrition, we can also use the information from pregnancy scanning to tell us which ewes are our passengers. So the table here, these are our ewes that are dry twice. So they're dry twice at 2 years and 3 years of age. And then in the table here, this is what happens to those ewes for the rest of their life. So they were dry at 2 years and 3 years of age, but between 4 and 6 years of age, you can see they have low fertility. They only generally have single-born lambs. Their survival is only about 60%, and their net weaning rate's only very low. So for ewes that are dry twice at 2 and 3 years of age, they're never going to be very good producers for you in terms of reproduction. So they are our passengers. And in Australia, we say to people, if your ewes are dry at 2 and 3 years of age, you want to cull them from your flock. If they have good wool production, so heavy fleeces of fine wool, you might keep them as dry sheep and just run them as wool cutters if the wool market is good, but you don't want them in your breeding flock anymore. So what sort of gain can we make? So this graph is showing you years along the bottom and the change in net reproduction rate on the axis. Now you can see for the first 2 years, you're not going to make any gain because you have to wait for 2 years to know which ones are your passengers. But you can see that by the 3rd year, you start to make improvements in your reproduction rate. And by the 4th year, you make a little bit more. And by the 5th year, you are making a 4% improvement annually in reproduction just by getting rid of those ewes that are not performing in your flock. Now, who are the performers? So how do we work out which ewes are rearing their lambs? So the simple way of doing that is to do an udder examination at marking, and that will tell you if a ewe has reared her lambs. It won't tell you how many lambs she's rearing, but it will tell you she's at least rearing some of them. So this is the same table as before, but it's got a bit more information. So in our middle column, this is the performance of ewes between 4 and 6 years of age that lambed once. So they successfully had a lamb either 2 or 3 years of age. And this is what their performance was between 4 and 6 years of age. And you can see that if you can compare this column to this column, all of those parameters are much greater. So just by lambing once at an early age, the ewes will have better fertility, slightly higher litter sizes, their survival of their lambs will be greater, and their weaning rate will be higher. And if you have a look at the column on the far side, these are the ewes that lamb twice, once at 2 years of age and once at 3 years of age, and their performance is better again. So by doing a simple check, by tipping the ewes over at marking, having a look at whether they reared their lamb or not, it can identify who those performers are. And we recommend in Australia you keep half of those best performing ewes in your flock. Keep them for 1 or 2 more lambings because they're doing the job for you, okay? It's really important though that you check them because it's no point in keeping the ewe in your flock more if she has some structural issues like problems with her udder or with her feet or with her teeth. She has to be sound so she can continue to do that good job she's been doing for you for 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6 years for another 2 years of her life. So we recommend you check those at marking, and any ewe that doesn't have a sound mouth, has problems with the udder or problems with her feet, even though she has done a good job for you so far, she might not do it for you again, so just check that. So again, this is the same graph I showed you before. But this time, the red bars is the gain you're going to get from keeping your performers. So from doing the wet and dry at marking, and keeping those best performing ewes for 1 or 2 more years. And you can see that we start to get a gain the 2nd year we start. So we get a gain of about 1%, and our gains increase as we go along. So we start with we get about a 7% improvement by keeping our older ewes for 1 or 2 more lambing opportunities. And the benefit from keeping your passengers, the benefit from getting rid of your passengers and keeping your performance add together. So they don't exclude each other, they add together. So by doing this simple strategy, you can make an 11% gain in reproduction rate by 8 years after you start. And if you were already using pregnancy scanning information to manage your nutrition of your animals, you're using that same information to make another decision. It's not costing you any more money. You can do this very simply. You can do this by simply putting an ear notch of a ewe if she's dry. And when you've come through a pregnancy scanning again, if the ewe comes up as dry again, she has an ear notch, you know she is your passenger, that you can get rid of her out of your flock. So you don't need any fancy tags. Just a simple ear notch will do the trick for you. Or, as I'll talk about talking about changing live weight later on, you can do it with electronic ID and get very fancy, but that's not necessary. As another example, we heard people talk about mulesing and fly strike yesterday. So I know it doesn't happen here, but it's a very big issue in Australia. And we know that the sheep blowfly is very attracted to animals that have a very wrinkly breech. And so the sheep industry in Australia have developed a scoring system to score sheep based on how wrinkly their bottoms are. So it goes from 1, sheep have a very plain bottom that the flies aren't attracted to, up to 5, the sheep are very wrinkly, and when the animal, the wool gets full of urine stain or gets full of feces stain, the bacteria and the smell attracts the blowflies, and we get lots of fly strike. So that's a 1 to 5 scoring system. And in Australia, our genetic evaluation system is called Merino Select, and we have Australian sheep breeding values, or ASBVs, which are like the EPG you were talking about yesterday, to select breeding values for plainer-bodied animals and to incorporate this information into breeding programs. But there is also potential to use this information in precision sheep management as well. So this is some data from some work I did a year or so ago, and it looks at the breech wrinkle scores of animals at marking, at yearling and adults, so about 8 to 10 weeks of age, 11 months of age as yearlings, and 2 years of age as adults. And you can see at marking, the animals have about a score of 3. The score decreases as they get older. But you can see that they're quite variable. Where is it? Okay. The CV, so you can see that even though the average is 3, it's quite variable. And if you look down to the distribution down the bottom, you can see that there are some animals in the flock that are very plain-bodied, that have very plain breeches, and there are ones that are very wrinkly. And it's the number 4 and number 5 are the ones that are going to cause problems with fly strike. So we can identify those number 4 and number 5 animals and remove them from our flock. We can cull the wrinkliest ones, or we can manage groups according to score. So you can cull them and take them out of your flock, or perhaps you would draft them and keep your wrinkly animals separate from your plain animals, and they're the ones that you have to treat with chemicals, and they're the ones you have to check more often than the other ones. So that gives us some options. In terms of genetic options, you can purchase low wrinkle rams when you buy your ram. So as well as looking for fleece traits and wool quality, you would also look for plain-bodied animals. You could then mate those plain rams with plainer ewes to improve the, to decrease the amount of wrinkle in your flock. So again, we can use the variation we see to our benefit. But we also have to not think in isolation. The sheep is a complex animal, especially when we're looking at lamb production, wool production, disease resistance traits. So we have to make sure that the decisions we are making on breech wrinkle are not affecting other traits. If we look at what's happening in the current generation in terms of our phenotypic variation, this is telling us what will happen in the sheep in front of us if we cull the wrinkliest ones. And we know that there's favourable relationships with live weight and wool quality. So our plainer animals will be bigger and they will have less variable wool quality. But they will also cut slightly less wool. But we think the benefits, that change is not very big, so it's a good thing to do. If we think about the genetic relationships, those relationships are quite similar, but the antagonistic or the bad relationship with fleece weight is higher. So you need to include wrinkle traits in the selection index so you can breed for plainer-bodied animals that still cut a lot of wool. So let's start talking about opportunities and start to think about other ways and new technologies we can use to help manage our sheep better into the future. So one opportunity to improve productivity in a flock is through managing live weight. So we know that changes in live weight affect key sheep production parameters. We know that ewe wool production is very much affected by their live weight. We know that lamb birth weight and survival is affected to a great degree by the live weight of their ewe at different stages during pregnancy. The potential of the progeny to grow is also affected by ewe live weight. And ewe nutrition during pregnancy affects follicle initiation in the developing fetus, which affects their lifetime progeny growth and fibre diameter. So it's very important to have systems that give us accurate and timely feedback on live weight. So one of the systems that's been developed in Australia is walk-over weighing. It's an animal-activated system to give us live weights from in the field. So basically what we have is we have a sheep entry or exit. That's the red arrow, horizontal arrow. And that's a way that the sheep can enter or leave a particular paddock. And then in that paddock you have some kind of attractant. It could be a water source, it could be a dam or a trough, or it could be a feeder with grain or hay, something that's going to encourage the sheep to move over the weight platform by themselves. So you need some load bars to carry the weight. You need some kind of data logger connecting to the load bars to record the weight. In Australia, we use solar panels to power the system. And you can use it on mob-based animals without any electronic tags or electronic tags. One of the things we have found, though, is that it's very important to have all your gear and your cables fenced away from the sheep, because otherwise they like to chew them and play with them, and it gets very frustrating. The other thing we have to think about is, how does the system know what is a valid weight? So what I've tried to show you here is our basic system up the top here. So here's our panel reader that reads our electronic tag. Here are our load bars, and here is our platform. So we need to work out what's a valid weight. And the valid weight occurs when you have one sheep on the platform and all of it on the platform. Okay, so it doesn't work if you only have the front feet on the platform. It doesn't work if you have the front feet of one sheep and the back feet of another. It might be four feet on the platform, but it's not the same sheep. And when I was doing that monitoring work with the weaners, sometimes, depending on how hot the day was, we could find 10 weaners in the platform at one time. So how do we know, when the system's in the paddock and it's collecting all this data on live weight, what's a valid weight and what's not? So making sense of the data is very important. So this is some data from some ewes at a commercial property way out west, a place called Burke in western New South Wales. And these ewes were walking over a walkover weigh system over 25 days. And you can see there's some peaks and there's some troughs. So obviously where these peaks, that's obviously when there was more than one sheep on there at once. And the troughs is what happens when only part of the sheep was on there at once. So that data feeds into the computer, and some software that a team has developed decides if it's a valid weight or not. And you can see that down here, the software has decided that the red dots, those weights are fine. They're the weights when all the sheep, one sheep was on the platform at once. And then you can see that that then gives us our live weight profile. We can see how the live weight of that ewe changed over time. So that behind the scenes data processing is very important, because with all this remote weighing, we need to have some smart software that tells us that the data we're getting is good data, not rubbish. So one way of using the system is not to use any electronic tags. You just have your weigh bar set up in the paddock, and the sheep just move over it during their going out their daily business. This is a group of about 200 weaners at our research station at Orange, and they were just set up over a period of, I think that's about 5 months, and they just walked over the attractant was water, and they just walked over the platform every time they got a drink, okay? What the system did is we weighed them on a static, we got a couple of reference weights, they're the pink dots, so we actually weighed them in a fixed crate, and then the system tells us the average weight, the standard deviation of weight, and the mob weight changes over time. So if we're looking at whether some of our lambs are ready to sell, get a sale weight, we can have a look and we can maybe just think, okay, well, our lambs are going really well here, this will be a good time to go in and draft some lambs off for sale. So it's giving us good information on when it's the right time to sell some sheep. Or, if you want to take a little step further, you can put an electronic tag in the animal's ear, and you can get information on what individual animals are doing. And again, this is some data from the trial I was doing with some weaner sheep on properties. And even though it's a very messy graph, each different colour is the weight of an individual animal at a different point in time. And even though it's a messy graph, what you can see is that these animals are the ones that are growing well. They're high live weight compared to the other, and they're growing well. We don't need to worry about those ones. The ones down here with the low live weight, or with a live weight that jumps up and down, they're the ones we have to worry about. Because we know in Australia, lighter weight weaners are more likely to catch a disease and not thrive and die. So perhaps they're the ones we would draft off and give it a little bit more feed, or perhaps think about a drench or something like that. Too fast. So what we always try and do when we think about these technologies is to try and add value. So we start with a simple system that allows us to weigh animals in the field, and then we start to think, what else can we do? What other information can we get from this system? And one of the things that I know some of you have heard about is something called pedigree matchmaker. So this is a way that we can find out the pedigree of animals just by moving across the walkover weighing system. And it's based on the premise that we know that lambs will follow their mothers. Okay, so that simple information is what's driving the science behind this concept. So what happens is that any time at lamb marking, so in Australia that's about 8 to 10 weeks of age, maybe 6 to 8 weeks of age, you tag all of the ewes with electronic tag, you tag all of the lambs. You put it together into a computer, into an Excel file, where you know which tag was on the ewe and you know which tag was on the lamb. Then you let them go in the paddock. And over 3 or 4 weeks, the animals will walk over the platform here. They'll just walk. So for this instance, all you need is a panel reader just to record the tag. So as the animals are walking across every day to get water, the system is recording a time sequence. So it records the time each tag goes across the platform. And again, we've got some software that then looks at that information and it associates which lambs are following which ewes the closest, and that gives you the maternal pedigree of those animals. So the work that we've done tells us it is between 85 and 96% accurate. In traditional mothering up in Australia involves lambing rounds in the morning, catching lambs, tagging them, disturbing the ewes and lambs. That is less accurate and more prone to error than what this is. We estimate the cost of this between $3 and $4 per animal. So very cost effective and very accurate. It gives you a maternal pedigree only. It doesn't tell you who the sire is. So you can either draft your ewes and lamb in sire groups, or use technology like that 15K chip that someone talked about yesterday to get the sire pedigree as well. So those cold and wet days when you spend out in the paddocks chasing lambs, doing lambing rounds, maybe we won't have to do that so much into the future, which is good news. Much as the lambs are cute to cuddle when it's cold and wet, it's not a very fun job day after day after day. So let's just pause a little bit and before I start talking a bit more about future opportunities and think about the benefits of precision sheep management. So we'll start by looking at the blue text on the left. So when traditionally we would manage our flock as a group. And in terms of improving our genetics, it was really based from a commercial producer's point of view on whereabouts you purchase your ram from. Which stud you purchase your rams from was determined the genetics of your flock. We would cull animals on age. So when the animals got to 6 years of age, we would just cull them all. Didn't matter how good they were or how bad they were, we would just get rid of them all. We would manage our breeding ewes on average condition. So if the ewes were an average score of fat score or a condition score of 2.5, we would feed them all. And if we needed to supplement animals, like I said, we would feed them all. Sometimes we would, depending on the relativity of wool and lamb prices, we might mate our older ewes to terminal size to take advantage of high lamb prices. If we were treating for parasites, for lice, or for worms, we would treat every animal. And if we were looking at mulesing to stop breech strike, we would mulese every animal. So that's kind of the way it was. By moving across to the right and looking at the text in red, you can see the opportunities that are provided to us by looking at individual animal management. We can now use effective selection amongst our ewes. So we can get rid of our passengers, keep our performers. That can be for reproduction, like I showed you, for breech wrinkle, for fleece quality, for growth, whatever trait you like. So we retain our animals on production. We only feed our animals according to their performance and their history. So again, that's giving us a saving because we're only feeding those animals that we know are going to require it. We start thinking about mating allocation of animals based on fitness for purpose. So for our best wool producers in the flock, the ewes that produce the finest fleeces, the heaviest cutting fleeces, we would mate them to finer, heavy cutting rams. The ewes that produce the broader fleeces, we would mate them to a terminal ram, again, so we can target the animals for the best purpose. We would treat disease as needed. We'd only treat animals for worms or against fly strike, only treat the animals that need it, which will help stop drench resistance, which is a big problem in parts of Australia. And with only mules according to breech score. So by moving from a position where you treat all animals the same to where you just manage them according to their potential, we can start to make some really good savings, but also improve our productivity. So in Australia, how does it work at the moment? So a lot of these technologies like walkover weighing and the software that works with the data was developed probably in the early 2000s by the Sheep CRC, which was a cooperative research centre funded by the Australian government, a partnership between state departments of agriculture and universities and CSIRO. That has now sort of moved on to another stage, and now we have a network of private service providers, consultants, who actually work with producers to implement this technology and this concept on farm. So they might run training workshops for sheep producers. So they'll get producers together and talk about exactly the sort of thing I've been talking about to you today, showing them the opportunities that this will provide them for their flock. They also may offer a contract data collection service. They will come to your farm and they will fleece weigh at shearing. They will collect mid-side samples for measurement. They will do pregnancy scanning. They will scan for fat and eye muscle depth. Although some of them also do contract live weight. So they'll actually come and collect the data and implement the system. They will help producers decide which system is best for them, which load bars to use, which tags to use, which readers to use. And some of them also do all the data management and selection and just give producers a list. Here are your passengers, here are your performers. So this is all done through private service through each of these companies. Let's start to think about what's happening into the future. And when I talked about Pedigree Matchmaker, I told you that it was a new advance on walkover weighing. And this is some work that a colleague of mine at University of New England has done, where they started to look at whether can we use the information from Pedigree Matchmaker to tell us more about the mothering ability of ewes. Because for those of us that work in the lamb survival area, we know that some ewes are much better mothers than others. And those better mothers look after the lambs better, that leads to better lamb survival. So can we get from this association between lambs and ewes, the information we're getting from Pedigree Matchmaker, can it tell us something about which ewes are the better mothers? So the compact and the close reads, the first two rows, that is telling us how quickly or how close the lamb is following the ewe as they move through the system. The average seconds tells us the time, the lapses between the ewe and the lamb going through the system, and the number of times is how many times they go through the system a day. So what they've found is there's that some of these, so this shows you the average, it shows you the phenotypic variance, and it shows you the heritability. So some of these traits are actually heritable traits and they're quite variable traits. And so what they've found is some associations between the higher birth weight lambs had the greater compatibility with their dams. And so this is only early work, but it is promising in showing us that we can actually start to pick out the lambs and ewes that have the best close association with each other, and it has favourable relationships on survival. We also know that they looked at this information, they looked at some later performance of those lambs, and the lambs that had the closest association with their mothers had higher weaning weights and higher greasy fleece weights at hoggets. So there's some production relationships between the compatibility with the ewe and the lamb. Now, the attractant for this trial, the animals had to go to and over the platform to get to water, and they found also some good relationships between how often the animals went to water and their production as well. So again, it's an example for you of how we can get more information from a technology that can help us to manage and identify our sheep into the future. Another example that is being done by some colleagues, again at the University of New England, is to use accelerometers to measure animal behaviour. Now, accelerometers are now everywhere. Each of us that have a smartphone, there's accelerometers in those. If you have teenagers like I do who have a Wii console or a PlayStation and who spend all their time on their Wii console or their PlayStation, there's accelerometers in those too. And because of the growth of the gaming industry, those accelerometers are getting smaller, better, and cheaper all the time. And so we can use those in sheep production to try and understand more about what the sheep are doing. So this is some work, again, done at the University of New England. And what they do is they fit an accelerometer onto a harness, and it just rests under the sheep's chin here. And then what they're finding is they can measure movement in the X, Y, and Z plane. So forward and back, side to side, and up and down. And by looking at the graph on the bottom, you can see that they can actually measure jaw movements and identify different patterns of rumination. So they can identify when an animal is chewing. It has a very clear signature. They can identify when an animal is swallowing. They can identify when it's regurgitating again to chew their cud again. And they can clearly identify when it's doing nothing. So this allows us to start quantifying rumen behaviour in the field where we're not interrupting the natural grazing behaviour of the sheep. So we can start to use that to look at maybe things like maybe some forages are more attractive. Maybe some types of food take longer to chew. So maybe we can start to link that type of information to how good our pastures is, and perhaps to help us to change our pasture to better match or improve the efficiency of feed conversion. And then the other thing they're trying to do is to start whether we can use this information to measure behaviour. So they put the accelerometers on the sheep in the paddock, and they set up video cameras. So while they were collecting the data from the accelerometers, whether their heads were up, down, whether they were running, so by looking at the variation or the differences between the X, Y, and Z axis, and looking at how fast things change, they can tell whether an animal was running, whether it had its head up, head down. And then they can match the accelerometer data with the data from their video recordings, and they can start to make decisions about whether an animal is grazing, whether it's walking, whether it's running. And so again, by not doing anything, by letting the animals do what they're doing in the paddock, we can start to get some information about what they're doing, and then that can help us perhaps in the future to maybe manage them a little bit better. One of the other things that we have been using, and I've been using it myself in some of the work I've been doing with looking at impacts of wild dog predation, is to use GPS collars. So satellite technology to look at what the sheep are doing in a paddock. So this is some work again, students in northern New South Wales. So these are two paddocks with shelter. So you can see there's a shelter belt in the centre of the paddocks. There's also some perimeter shelter around. And so this project was looking at whether sheep are using the shelter on, I can't remember exactly which way it goes, but one of the graphs is wind from one direction and the other graph is wind from the other direction, okay? So it's showing you that yes, the sheep do use shelter and they change whereabouts they are in the paddock depending on which way the wind is coming from. So this can help us in a number of ways. It can help us to understand if we are going to use shelter for lambing ewes, which is recommended in some parts of Victoria in Australia, where the weather during lambing is very bad. You can have large lamb losses if a cold front comes in and the weather gets very cold. It can help us to decide where the best place is to put shelter in our paddocks. And it can also help us to decide where might be the best place to maybe feed our sheep or to put troughs in. And again, just by monitoring what the sheep are doing in the paddock, can give us the extra information. I've been doing I had an experiment at the start of this year where I'm starting to look at how sheep respond to wild dog attacks. So in Australia, that's a very big problem for us at the moment, where we have wild dogs that come in and they kill and they maim stock. But for the animals that are in the flock that aren't attacked, how does that stress of being moved and having that on a daily basis impact on their production? And so we used GPS collars. We had them on the sheep in the paddock. We had them on some pretend wild dogs I had running around the sheep, and we can start to see how the sheep react to the wild dogs and whether they avoid parts of the paddock or how they use the paddock up after this is happening. So it's very good technology, and again, GPS trackers are now very cheap. So it's very good, very cheap technology to use. And this is another example of how we can use technology to give us different information. So this is some work by a computer science lecturer, and he's starting to try and work out, are there other ways that we can get information about parasite burden in sheep? So apart from fecal egg count and perhaps monitoring live weight, can we use GPS and movements to look at which animals are affected by parasites and which aren't? So the graph on the left shows you the time and then number of movements, or the average number of movements. The average and then the variation is the dotted lines over a period of time. And the graph on the right shows you the relationship between the distance moved by the sheep and their fecal egg count. And what this is telling us is the animals with the higher fecal egg count, the ones the most affected by parasites, move the most. We're not quite sure why that is happening. It could be because the parasites are sucking the nutrients out of the animal. They actually have to move around to graze more. Or maybe they simply have to move around to drink more. But either way, the animals with the higher parasites are moving more, they're using more energy, and their production is decreasing. So again, another way of using technology to work out, based on what an animal is doing in the paddock, if there is something wrong with them or not. So let's go back to my first slide. That's our same group of animals, but they're not the same. So their performance is different. And into the future, we will have accelerometers or GPS collars, or I have used eye-button temperature sensors to measure core temperature, or perhaps heart rate monitors to measure stress. So all this information you can feed in remotely through data capture and cell phone technology into your computer. So by sitting in your computer, in your office where it's nice and warm and there's no rain and wind, you should know exactly what each of your sheep is doing. Whether they are using the paddock evenly in terms of grazing, whether they have an issue with parasites. If you link it in with their performance from pregnancy scanning and from marking, you'll know which ones are your passengers and which ones are your performers. So you will know very quickly which of those sheep, which of your sheep are your passengers? Which are the ones that perhaps are more prone to disease? Which ones don't have very many lambs for you? They're the ones you want to get rid of your flock. You will know pretty clearly which ones are your performers. The ones that have 2 or more lambs that rear those lambs, the ones with the finest, heaviest fleeces, they're the ones you want to keep. They're the ones that perform for you without any extra help from you. It will also tell you what I am calling the managers. So these are the ones whose performance isn't quite as good as those, but if you gave them a bit of help, you could make them into your performers. If you targeted nutrition or targeted disease, you could make them into your performers. So this is a bit of a glimpse of the future of what this new technology can offer us, both as researchers and also sheep producers. Thank you.